Okay, I'd like to call the Hinckley Township Special Meeting of the Board of Trustees to order at 6:31 p.m. Can I get a second from Trustee Asherle, Trustee Sweattick?
Who seconded?
Seconded by Asherle. All in favor say aye. Aye. This is the purpose of this meeting is for the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee. At this time, I'd like to make a motion to approve the steering committee meeting minutes from January 25th, 2022. Can I get a second?
Second.
I'm going to take the Asherle, Trustee Asherle, seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. Very good. Thank you. And I'm going to go through a quick roll call. Paul Easterling.
Here.
Maria Griffiths.
Here.
Lou Benson.
Here.
David Yatsko.
Here.
Mr. Pearl has an excused absence. Paul O'Neill.
Here.
Gary Wolney.
Here.
Brian Cadnam.
Here.
Jacob Studer.
Here.
Kara Pay has an excused absence. Kenton Grimes. I think he was going to try to come on.
Kevin Grimes, could you do me a favor? Could you just move down there so that I can see all of that? I'm so sorry.
Kenton Grimes is not with us tonight. I think he is coming in virtually. Chris Kleena is also not here. Tom Schrader is not here, but he will be here soon. Cindy Egelman is virtual. Jim Bialowski.
Yes.
And trustees Augustine, Asherle, and Sweattick are all here. I'll give you the spelling of those names.
Thank you.
All right. There was a meeting this morning. It was a work session meeting this morning at 11:30. It didn't end until probably about 2:45. One of the topics that was brought up specifically was that the steering committee was not maybe chosen in the right manner, that there was bias in the selection, and I have to respectfully disagree. There are a lot of subjective comments that are a part of the applications that everyone submitted, and out of 98 applications, the information that was shared publicly was only for the final 15. It did not include the 45 applications that the trustees sent to the police station. So I want you to know that I stand by this committee and I support your efforts in being here, and I thank you for your service to Hinckley Township. All right, at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Arthur from OHM Planning. Oh, welcome. Hi.
Make sure I'm doing this properly. Sure. Yep. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Arthur Schmidt. I am a project manager and senior planner with OHM Advisors, and I am here this evening to help facilitate the discussion around this comprehensive plan audit. I was not present at the last meeting, and that was by design. Wanted to give a chance for the steering committee members to meet one another, to hear comments from members of the public. The meeting was recorded, and I did review the meeting, sat down, took a look at everything, listened into the comments that were made, discussion that everyone had. So this evening, I'm going to go through a presentation and overview. You have an agenda this evening, and I'll go through it here in the presentation as well of what we're going to be discussing. Overarchingly, talk about what the purpose of this comprehensive plan audit is, what the ultimate goal of this process is. Talk about our initial review, our staff's review of the comprehensive plan as it stands right now from 2015 and the recent developments that have occurred and kind of what's going on there. And then talk about what we had heard in the last meeting that you all had about a month ago and some of the discussion points, some topics to talk about there. And then we can have a discussion around those topic points and then finally talk about next steps. So just a little bit background about myself. Like I said, my name is Arthur Schmidt. I'm a Medina County resident. I live right next door in the city of Brunswick. A little fun fact, I guess, about myself, grew up in Parma, but my parents owned property here in Hinckley Township over by Stony Hill and Laurel. For about the first 22 years of my life, and with the intention of moving, but it just never happened. I don't know, cold feet, whatever the case may be. They ended up selling that property, and I think I remember talking with them, enjoying coming down to maintain the property, cut the grass, come down to the corner store and get some ice cream when they still have ice cream with the the wooden sticks that you had to eat it with. I thought that was, the best thing in the whole wide world. And I thought it was like a million miles away when we come down here from Parma. And then I end up moving in Brunswick with my wife because she works down at Akron General Hospital and I work up in Cleveland. So small world, right? So OHM Advisors, we were part of the team that helped craft the 2015 comprehensive plan. And so that's why members of the trustees had brought us on board as the previous authors of the comprehensive plan. Felt it made a lot of sense for us to take a look at it. I will tell you that I was not with OHM at that time. We still have staff members who were part of that team and helped develop that plan, but I kind of bring a fresh perspective to the table. My background before being a member of OHM Advisors, I was a city planner with the city of Cleveland, working in their zoning and planning department. And then I've joined OHM. So since that time, we've expanded a little bit within our OHM offices. We have offices in Cleveland, in Akron, as well as in Columbus and Ohio. 16 studios throughout Ohio, that state up north, and Tennessee, and a variety of disciplines, including engineering, planning, and zoning. And so the other thing I wanted to point out in terms of our background is not only were we the authors and assisted with the development of the Hinckley Comprehensive Plan, but we've done other communities as well, as you can see on the screen, ranging from small town communities to larger municipalities. So our team has a good experience, a good background with doing this, so we feel that we can offer you some good insight into what's going on. As I said before, for the agenda, just going to talk firstly about what the purpose of this is, what the overall goal is, what our final deliverable is in the process. Talk about our initial review and evaluation of the comprehensive plan from the last meeting. I know that you all have started to take a look at it, have some of your thoughts and comments with it. So we're going to provide our feedback just from our personal audit of it. Then, as I said before, we'll talk about what we heard at the last meeting, discuss some of kind of the overarching themes and topics, have a discussion, and then we'll talk about next steps. When we'll be getting together next, what are we going to be doing in the meantime, conversations about a community survey, what that looks like, what are the type of questions, and we'll go from there. So firstly, in terms of the purpose and goal of this plan audit, that is, quite frankly, to review the comprehensive plan with respect to what's been going on lately in Hinckley Township and to identify if there's a need to change and or update elements of this comprehensive plan or other related policy documents like the zoning code or design guidelines, whatever the case may be. So what we're here to do and what we want to assist you in doing is determine, again, if the comprehensive plan needs to be changed. And if the answer is yes, then what do we need to do to change it? Is it the comprehensive plan? Is it the zoning code? Are there things we need to add? Are there things we need to adjust? That's the question that we're posing to you all as steering committee members. That's the question we're posing to the public. And ultimately, at the end of this, it's a recommendation given to the trustees to determine what that next step is. So at the conclusion of this audit, our goal is, again, to determine if we need changes. And so if the answer is yes, we need changes, what are those changes? What are the changes that we need to make in order to align with the vision of the township? If the answer is no, then what are the other tools that maybe that we can address, develop to assist the township in what the issues are currently? So I think this was talked about at the last meeting. Going through a full comprehensive plan update is a long endeavor and it's expensive to do. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of comprehensive planning, hence the comprehensive plan, right? So the idea here is to really just kind of take a step back and look at this from a higher level view and really get down to see what are the issues going on right now? Where are the conflicts going on with recent development trends, with recent development applications as it relates to the comprehensive plan and how we can begin to move that forward? As we talk about the role of the steering committee, we want to make it, or I would like to make it clear kind of what that direction is. And so you all as the steering committee are giving us direction on how to engage the community. And by us, I mean OHM, our team. How should we engage the community? We want you to share insights with us. We want you to share your insights and your analysis. We want you to act as the liaisons, to the community groups and organizations. So we have members of the community here who can interact with us. We want the members of the community to interact with us. We want them to interact with you as members of the steering committee, talk with you, have conversations, express what their concerns are, what their insights are, what their analysis is. And then for you all to analyze that, understand that, and talk back to us, right? It's a nice kind of clean way for all of us to communicate and ultimately work together. And so as it says up there, you're essentially assisting us as we're conducting this audit. So we as OHM are conducting the audit kind of in our lane. You all are reviewing the comp plan in your lane. And then simultaneously working with the community, hearing out the community about their concerns and the items that they want to raise attention to. And so we all kind of work together. And then at the end of this, we're going to provide to you as the steering committee our recommendation to what needs to happen as it relates to the comprehensive plan. Does it need to be completely updated? Are there tweaks? So on and so forth. You'll review that recommendation, and then ultimately together we'll make that recommendation to the trustees of the township to move forward. In terms of the overall process and schedule, kind of the where we're at and where we're headed, we're essentially starting now in this phase one, kind of asking the question, where are we now? Where are we now? What's working? What's not? What are the issues? Starting to really inform ourselves of what we need to be looking at a little bit more closely. The next part of that phase is the outreach. It's a continued outreach with the community members. I encourage community members to continue to reach out to you all to express their concerns and their insights, but we're also going to outreach them in the form of a community survey. We'll talk about that here in a little bit or a little later on in this presentation, what that survey looks like, what the time frame for it is, and all those kind of nuances there. Then once we get that feedback from the survey, from you all, from our discourse tonight, we're going to begin to further analyze what needs to be updated. Again, asking that overarching question, is it the entire comprehensive plan that needs to be updated, or are there components of the comprehensive plan that we need to update? And then ultimately at the end of this, give our recommendation. We'll give that recommendation to you as a steering committee, and then together discuss and ultimately give that recommendation to the Board of Trustees and move forward from there. Before I move on to kind of our review of things, I wanted to ask members of the steering committee if you all had any questions related to purpose, ultimate end goal, process, schedule, anything related to that. Awesome. So this next part.
I have a question.
Please.
Can you state your name?
My name is Paul O'Neill. And what was the process of you being here?
The process of me being here to help with the plan audit, that is, so the comprehensive plan audit.
Yes, who called you up?
Contacted by former trustee Chris Kalina, who
Former trustee, I'm having trouble hearing. Can you talk?
Sure. Former Hinckley trustee Chris Kalina, who reached out to me. Our team, actually, I shouldn't say just me. They reached out to the OHM team because there was recent development proposals that had come through the township that had been conflicting a little bit with what the proposed goal was for the comprehensive plan and what the zoning code was allowing. So I think initially the contact related around reviewing a couple of proposals that were coming in as it relates to zoning code ordinances and the comprehensive plan, and how the two maybe might be a little bit in conflict with what is being proposed. And that's when the discussion took place with respect to maybe it was necessary to update the overall comprehensive plan. And in our discussions with Trustee Kalina, we indicated that we could do that, but that the cost, time, and expense of that would not be cheap, essentially. And we said that maybe it might be better served to do a comprehensive plan audit, which is to do a comprehensive plan audit. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. To do a comprehensive plan audit. And what that means, again, is to review the plan as it is right now, review recent development proposals that have come through the township, and see where there's a little bit of confusion or where there is potential for conflict between what the comprehensive plan is indicating, maybe even what the zoning code is allowing legally, and what the submissions are requesting. And so from that conversation, that's when we started talking about doing this comprehensive plan audit, what that would look like, time frame, and I believe it was December, November. There was a presentation that we gave. We gave a presentation of our proposal to the Board of Trustees at that time, and I think it was a recommendation. October.
And then we went ahead and signed a contract in December.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a new father. It's only new by a year, but I have dad brain already in terms of time frame. So, there's no sleep, nothing like that.
I have another question. There's the conservation zoning that is, it's very controversial. And I guess that was a zoning change that was put into place, I guess, when Apple Development did a project at Wakefield Run. I might have that wrong. Was your firm involved with that language of the zoning language?
Not to my knowledge, Paul. Not to my knowledge. I believe, and I would have to double check myself on this, but I believe our firm's involvement was only in the development of the 2015 comprehensive plan. Yeah. Any other questions from the steering committee about process?
Are you fully
Did you say your
knowledgeable?
name?
I'm sorry. My name is Brian Cadnam.
I'm sorry?
Brian Cadnam, Cadnum. On the subject of the conservation developments, are you fully aware of all those rules that govern it?
Yes, I've reviewed through them within the zoning code right now, and we also have members of our team who've developed them from scratch, those conservation developments. So not only myself am I familiar with them, we also have members of our team who have utilized them in other municipalities and other situations that I can reach out to and have conversations with.
Okay, my question is really quite simple. An 100-acre parcel would, regardless of terrain, if there's a suitable area, can you then have 50 homes in a conservation development?
So your question, Brian, is I want to make sure I understand it correctly. So your question, Brian, is you're asking that if you have 100 acres and you have 50 acres available to you in there for the open space requirement, can you use the other 50 then for development, for residential development?
I
Correct.
think that's what he was saying.
I don't
No.
think that's.
I don't know who's talking.
We are
You
going,
have to speak in when you talk, because I don't know who you are. So I just heard somebody else talking on the news, so I need to know. If anyone speaks up, I just need to know who's talking.
we are going to slow
I'm sorry?
down. We are going to slow down.
Okay, I spoke, Paul O'Neill, I spoke up and I said, I don't think that's what Brian was saying. What I think Brian's saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, if you have a 100-acre piece of property, a parcel, or a group of co-joining parcels, can you put 50 homes in that, no matter what the terrain is? So can you take those 50 homes and even put them on a 10-acre part of that 100 acres? Do I have that right, Brian?
That's close.
Jim Bielanski. I think that's more of a zoning definition question than a comprehensive plan question, because that's defined within the zoning regs regulations. I'm using as a general term. That's defined within zoning for the conservation district on what's allowed to be built. It's a yield for that property. And correct me if I'm wrong, anybody?
You're on the button.
But 100 acres, if it's deemed and awarded, because it doesn't automatically become a conservation district, they look at a yield. That means normally 2 acres would be 50 max you could put within there. You set aside 10 acres as a conservation, now you're putting 50 within 90 acres. And that's how the calculation, the way I understand it, is done.
Are you on
Correct.
the zoning commission?
Not at all.
Okay, speak up. I gotta see your name. Are you on the zoning commission? You said that.
Brian Cadnam.
Brian,
So thank you, Jim, Paul, and Brian. So Jim is correct. No, it's not just straight. There's other regulations that are a part of that, that are attributed to what you can and cannot develop as part of that conservation development. And it is something that we will talk about, or I will bring up as part of this presentation, because I know that was a topic of conversation during the last meeting. Jim also rightfully put that in the comprehensive plan, that regulation is not associated with the comprehensive plan. It's referenced in the comprehensive plan, talking about conservation development as a tool to help regulate kind of the vision of the comprehensive plan. And I think as I go through the second part of the presentation with the plan review, as we kind of see it at this moment, right, in terms of the audit, I think that'll kind of help paint that picture a little bit clearer with respect to elements of the comprehensive plan that could be addressed, and then elements of the zoning ordinance, the zoning regulations that would need to be addressed as part of that.
Paul O'Neill, I have a question. What's your opinion on conservation concepts? Do you think they're a good thing or a bad thing as far as a town that's trying to keep its rural character?
I think my personal and professional opinions, I think they can be good tools if they are written and designed in the fashion that is desired by the community, township, or village that's trying to apply them. Because kind of a blanket statement of indicating they are either good or bad is a little tough to just say, because there are elements of the regulations that are associated with the conservation developments that pertain to setbacks, both front and rear yard setbacks, landscaping, buffer zones, that if those aren't outlined in the fashion that's desired by the community, we'll just say, it won't be as effective in what the ultimate goal is. So you can have a conservation development, but if those elements aren't kind of calibrated the proper way, the desired way for the community, then the conservation development may not yield the type of project or the aesthetic that the goal was to yield.
The goal was
To yield.
Who's speaking?
She didn't identify herself.
And we'll talk, and Paul, we'll talk about that a little bit more, because I have a small example in this presentation to kind of talk about that and go through a little bit of the nuances. And again, that dives into more of the zoning code. However, it's important to understand that as it relates back to the comprehensive plan, because if the comprehensive plan is advocating and suggesting that as an action, as a tool to create the vision that's desired, then that could be a question too of, okay, if the comprehensive plan is suggesting or advocating for the use of conservation developments as a tool to achieve and regulate the vision, then we need to potentially look at the zoning code to see how are those regulations outlined. So Brian, going back to your question, what are the specific regulations associated with the conservation development, and do those align with what the ultimate goal is? If the ultimate goal is to maintain the rural character, let's say, of the township or the community that you're in. So that is an important question, and one that we'll continue to talk about here.
Paul O'Neill, just so you know, I'm a farmer. Brian's a farmer, so I think our perspective is keeping Hinckley rural as farming, but that's not necessarily the viewpoint of everybody in the town. At the last meeting, we had an interesting discussion where I believe it was up in Wakefield Run. Brian used to farm that land. It was a conservation development. A bunch of the land was put into conservation, but Brian's not allowed to farm it anymore. It's part of the homeowners association, and they're probably just going to turn it into wasteland, a jungle, just let it grow with unmanaged forest. I'm not sure what they're going to do. Maybe they're going to mow it. Towns that I've lived in before, usually that conservation land is put into the trust of the town. And then the town can lease it out to farmers or manage it in a better way. And right now, anybody can put a conservation district or a conservation property anywhere in the residential area of the town.
Go ahead.
In the, what is it,
There's an acreage minimum.
you have to identify yourself.
I'm not that good. I mean,
Jim Bialowski, there is a minimum number of acreage that has to be the plot for now, and zoning, correct me, before it even can be considered for the conservation area. So if you had, use your example, a residential area that had 2 acres there, that cannot be a conservation district. It's that the entirety of the plot or land is taken into consideration first. Then there's a process they have to go through.
Okay, so Paul O'Neill speaking again. So they had a lawsuit with the Wakefield Run development, and then the zoning language was changed, but I think it was more of a Band-Aid just to stop what had been put into the zoning laws. And I believe there's a lot of good intent that went into the original language, and then got misused. And so my opinion is that needs a complete retune, which would be something that you might be able to address. There's some people that are so upset with it, they just wanted to eliminate it, which that might be what everybody wants. I don't know. So I don't know if you can address to our group and the town, you know, give us some balance, ideas to think about there.
Yep. And that's a good question, Paul. And as I go through this, I will start to address that, and then I will make sure to come back and fully address that question further as it relates to the conservation development.
O'Neill again. The other big issue was senior housing. That's like a lightning rod issue. There's a project that I believe was approved. It was within the zoning laws. It was, yes, Mr. Walney's property. And there's a lot of people here that are upset with that. I really feel it doesn't affect me at all, but I think that would probably need to be addressed by you. I don't know if that's a tune-up of the plan or a rewrite of the zoning. And I just wanted to bring it up with you since we're talking about what we're kind of scoping with you.
Yep, absolutely. And I think you're hitting all the topics that I'm going to touch on here, as well as discuss when we talk about the previous meeting. Senior housing was one of those other topics as well.
Okay.
So this next part that I want to go through is just, again, our initial review, our initial kind of audit of the 2015 comprehensive plan. So these next few slides here are just highlighting a few things that stood out to us. Some things that just kind of raising some additional questions for you and the community to think about and to consider. There's some thoughts that we have behind them, but again, we're going to kind of offer our thoughts and our professional opinions and bounce them off of you and the community and kind of, again, bring consensus together, hopefully, as part of this audit. So the first thing, and this was discussed at the last meeting, is just to clearly state what is a comprehensive plan. And this is taken directly from the 2015 plan with a few points highlighted in that the comprehensive plan is a blueprint that's defining the community vision, and it's providing a framework to guide that future development of zoning and other plans and policies. And so those three words that I'm highlighting right there, blueprint, vision, and framework to guide, is ultimately with what we do as a planning firm and we do as a planning profession as it relates to comprehensive plans. That is what a comprehensive plan is. It's a blueprint, it's a vision for the future, and it outlines how does the community ultimately want to achieve that vision, that blueprint that they've brought consensus to. And so as part of that, yes, there we go. It's a little delayed. As part of that, there are other, as we were talking about before, there are other kind of instruments. There's other tools that are used alongside the comprehensive plan in order to implement. So the comprehensive plan begins to inform the evolution of zoning and subdivision regulations. So as we were talking about before, the zoning ordinances, conservation development language. It helps to guide capital investments. Where does the community want to invest their hard-earned dollars into as it relates to capital improvements, excuse me. The location of any future community facilities and again, additional infrastructure. It starts to promote economic development in doing so because it's identifying areas that there is a desire for growth. It's also identifying areas where there is no desire for growth, areas that we want to protect, areas that we want to conserve, right? So it's beginning to narrow the focus of any potential development to specific areas. And when we talk about development, we are talking about both commercial and residential. But oftentimes in a comprehensive plan, it's a little bit more focused on commercial development, commercial zoning type development, industrial type development, but it does take into consideration residential growth as well. And then lastly, as stated in the plan, acquisition, development of any public or semi-public properties such as parks and greenways and open spaces. And that goes back to the conservation perspective. That goes back to protecting specific lands. So in the 2015 comprehensive plan, these were the 5 key themes that came from the planning process listed there. So it was grow carefully and keep Hinckley rural. It was planning for seniors. It was preserving the natural environment. It was enhancing the town center, and it was keeping growth to the west. And you'll see those little points underneath each of those. So when we talk about grow carefully and keeping Hinckley rural, it was talking about protecting the rural character of Hinckley and carefully planning for new growth in order to preserve that existing community character. When we talk about planning for seniors, it was talking about, what are some smaller scale senior housing, which is less than the 2-acre minimum that's required under the residential zoning district to provide lower maintenance. It was talking about when we talk about the preserve the natural environment, that distinct character with the natural surroundings and features that are located here in Hinckley, with enhancing the town center. It was thought the town center is seen as kind of the social and civic hub of the township. So how do we continue to maintain that, but potentially enhance it? And then when we talk about growth, the comprehensive plan was beginning to identify that area of growth would be most appropriate, kind of that area bordering Brunswick and that I-71 corridor along the West 130th corridor as the most appropriate for any type of commercial or industrial growth. So that was what was started to be identified as those key themes in there. Jim, you have a question?
A question. Going back to number 2, the plan for seniors. In reviewing all the data in the last plan, I question whether that was the voice of the community at that point in time. 65 people out of 8,000 roughly responded some answer for senior housing. I don't think that was representative of the community. And I think as this plan is developed or any potential enhancements, we need to engage a larger segment of the community. We can talk about ideas for that later. But 65 people responding to that, I don't think is representative of the whole township.
And Jim, that's a really good point that you bring up because, and again, I'm jumping ahead slightly here, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. But one of the suggestions that we have is kind of asking these questions again of you all as the steering committee and of the community. Are these themes still relevant? Are these key themes that were identified in the 2015 comprehensive plan still relevant? And if they're not, that's okay. What is there a theme that has kind of raised up to the level of being identified as a key theme now, right? Again, that could point into the direction of wanting to go through a comprehensive plan update, a true comprehensive plan update where there's that fuller engagement to understand what those key themes are. But in the meantime, before maybe that endeavor is undertook and decided on, some of these key themes could be taken away for the time being as that interim period, correct? Until that fuller conversation can be had and that discourse can be had as well to identify what is a new key theme that's happening right now. So I think that's an excellent point that you bring up, and one that you'll see that we'll talk about too at the end, asking to the committee and to the community, are these key themes still relevant? Because that's what was helping to drive some of the action items and plan components of the comprehensive plan. The next set of maps that I want to show were developed again as part of the comprehensive plan. And I think they're not all the maps, but I thought we felt these were some key maps to talk about and maybe talk about for the future as we continue our engagement and involvement with the community. So this is showing the preserve and grow maps. So this was an activity that was done during the public meetings. It's showing that the green dots are areas to preserve. And by the way, really quickly, this is some great screen resolution because we've done some meetings where the colors just do not pop on the screen. Sorry, I digress. Green are areas to preserve. Red are areas to grow. And so you can begin to see that we highlighted with the white circles areas that, we have a mix of both kind of preserve and grow around the town center. We have a healthy mix of areas to preserve along there, kind of on the north eastern side of town. And then you can see the heavy mix of areas to grow along that West 130th corridor, the area that borders the city of Brunswick right there. Again, as an outsider, but a Medina County resident looking at this, and as a planner, those areas seem to make sense, especially as it relates to areas of growth. Along that West 130th corridor, as you're bordering Brunswick, makes sense in terms of those could potentially be areas to develop for a number of reasons, one of which we'll get to in terms of the infrastructure that's available there, but also just what the character of that corridor is. And I think from some of the other elements we looked at, in order to kind of preserve the rest of the township, if there is a desire for growth, again, begins to make some sense that that's where you would want to point that growth towards. What that growth looks like, how it functions, that's obviously another question that needs to be discussed and we'll talk about here. But in terms of where it's appropriate, again, that seems to make some sense. That area in the middle, in terms of the town center, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. It's a little bit of, you can see both sides of the coin. There's a charm that's here that's unlike any other. But I'm sure there's also some individuals, members of the community that would like to see some other amenities that are offered there. So there's a balance that needs to happen there without question. And there's different ways that can happen. And there's different ways too to make sure that the existing character is preserved as well.
Hold on 1 second, okay?
Sure. No problem. This next map is just identifying environmentally sensitive areas. And the reason I'm bringing this back up in the conversation is myself and my other colleagues, as we were reviewing this, the areas in terms of where we have the 100-year floodplain, but more so where we have those steep slopes are rather significant. And again, if you begin to overlay some of these maps together related to what the existing land use is, what the environmentally sensitive areas are, I think we have a couple additional maps here that talk about where at the time of 2015, water and sewer infrastructure were located. You can start to kind of see how that area along West 130th, for example, was identified as a potential area for commercial and potentially even industrial development because it's a little bit easier over there than in other areas. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. If you put enough, I talk to my engineering friends all the time, you can engineer anything, essentially. It just comes down to cost. How much do you want to pay to engineer those elements? And, we've reviewed projects in the past as it relates to that, those types of engineering efforts to address some of the environmentally sensitive areas in order to create the development. So this is not to say that it prohibits development, but it does make it more costly, and it's something that is, potential developers consider. So then the next map is talking again about this is where, again, this is the 2015 map. So if this is off by a little bit, that's quite possible. But this here is showing water lines in blue, sanitary lines in purple, and then the parcels in that yellow gold is land which does have access to that sanitary and to that water potentially. So you can see there, I think there was approximately 5,800, acres of land that at least have part of their parcel that's within that 100 feet of an existing sanitary sewer or water line. So why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this map? Why were we talking about the environmentally sensitive area map? Why are we talking about the activity done at the public meetings in terms of areas to grow and areas to preserve? Is because ultimately those maps and that input help to inform the future land use map. So to the left is the future land use map that's within the 2015 comprehensive plan. To the right, what I put there was the chart of the current land use, just to have some comparison factors in terms of what's there currently. The kind of colors between both maps were getting a little confusing as we were reviewing the presentation. So I wanted to simplify this a little bit. So I don't know if nope, it's not going to work. Okay, let's see if my laser pointer would work. So to that western edge of the township, again, along that West 130th corridor, the future land use map is starting to call for that commercial industrial type development. It's keeping the town center footprint in the center of town. I do believe it begins to expand that footprint of what would be considered the town center for potentially future development. You begin to see the residentially zoned areas, the Hinckley Reservation, and then you begin to see the areas where it's not only residential, but calling for the conservation type development in that residential areas. So what this map was beginning to do was, and I think we were talking about it before with Paul, Brian, and Jim, was the map was trying to identify what are those large tracts of land, that potentially 100 plus acres that could be developed in a larger way for residential development, and beginning to put in place the tools to make sure we're limiting maybe that residential and making sure that the open space is maintained within that new residential. The last thing that you will see, obviously, not obviously, but the last thing you will see up in the top corner at the intersection of Boston and West 130th is the neighborhood commercial land use district up there. So with that is, again, taken from the 2015 comprehensive plan, we're taken directly from there, is the zoning map. So you will see here, very straightforward, very simple. As an individual who works with a lot of municipality zoning code, this is a zoning district map that I can personally appreciate because of how straightforward it is. You could go to other communities and see how convoluted and complicated they can get, but R1, R2 zoning districts, the distinction between the R1 and R2 based on the acreage minimum, the light industrial, the two categories of the light manufacturing, and then you have the town center and general business in terms of the zoning. And again, the chart on the right is from the comprehensive plan showing the breakdown in acreage and percentage of total land of what the zoning is. So you can see, roughly 97% of the township is some sort of residential. 92 of that is the R1 with the 2 acre minimum. The rest is either the B1, B2, or the industrial zone district. Now, why are those two previous maps important? And I have them next to each other is because ultimately the future land use map that is to the right wants to begin to speak to the zoning map that's on the left. Point of clarification, the comprehensive plan does not automatically update the zoning district map. It informs the zoning district map. So those are two separate processes that have to go through. So as you go through a comprehensive plan in terms of order of operations, you would go through a comprehensive plan. You would develop a future land use map based on the feedback and the process that was undertook. And then that future land use map, which is to the right, would begin to inform an update to the zoning district map on the left. And so as you see right now, you can see, and it's a little confusing because of the color palette, but on the right with the future land use map, you have commercial properties that are being called for commercial land uses, not zoned either commercial or even industrial on the left, right? You have the area that you're calling out for as an expanded town center that's not zoned that way on the left as well. You have some of the conservation districts, maybe up into the upper left corner of town, that are conservation districts but are zoned the R2, which is the lower acreage minimum. So there's some things there right off the bat as we talk about this audit and some of our observations that the two aren't speaking to one another in the right way. And I think in some of the previous submissions that were done for conditional uses for BZA, and I think we have a member of BZA on our committee, oftentimes the applicant will probably raise the question that the zoning map is not agreeing with the future land use map and bringing elements of the comprehensive plan into the equation for consideration.
Question, Gary Walney. With the zoning, I understand what you're saying, that the one on the right is the future look, the left is the zoning as today. Is there in the zoning plan for this year within the group a plan to move to mimic more of the right palette?
Gary, I don't have that answer.
I'm asking Mr. Manley, with the zoning board agenda for the year, if there is such?
What the zoning board has been at for the last year or so is making minor adjustments. Not to answer your question specifically, no.
Okay.
At this point in time.
Okay.
And instead, I was on the BZA when you were on zoning board now.
Okay. Well, would that be an intention to move towards that?
I can't speak for the chair. From my own perspective, I would listen if somebody could, it's a long, drawn-out process.
Understood.
Look at what happens for somebody has a piece of property that they want to build on and it falls within one of the districts.
Right.
They just come in front of the zoning board, they present their plan. It's easier to explain with the commercial thing because it's a little more drawn out. They come with their plan and all this stuff. We send them back to do various impact studies and it drags out over 5 or 6 months and public hearings and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, we've kind of spent some time over there, but on the residential thing, I just don't, I'm not understanding that exactly. I understand what you're saying is why don't you go in there and make this match that?
Well, that would be, I think that's the intent of the drawing on the right.
Some of the stuff we can't change because the courts did it, which we, are
Understood.
getting into all that kind of stuff. So I'd have to look at my book's at home with all the maps.
But I mean, that would be the way I understand the process is that if the comprehensive plan created the picture on the right, the direction of the township then would be to have the zoning regulations mirror that over X. I don't know what X
They're pretty
is.
close. I mean, they're not perfect, but I think
Okay.
they're pretty close.
But again, those,
May I suggest Marcus Fisher is the chairman? Maybe you could send him a note and ask him to put that on one of the agendas.
But
I'm just a member of the committee.
understood.
in consideration of that, I think we also need to talk to the residents to find out. That may be outdated on the right. They may not want more commercial development. They may not want other changes. So before it's saying, let's adopt what's on the right, let's make sure, what's the intent? What do people want?
Understood. My question was, is there anything in the process now in the zoning,
In the short answer is no.
in this year, are you doing anything to mirror what's on the right? Just so we as a group would understand that and could then address it. That was the purpose of the question.
And to add to that conversation, the map on the right does not automatically have to fully inform the map on the left, the zoning district map, because oftentimes there is a gap between when the two are done. Now, in the few instances that I know that I have been a part and our company OHM has been a part of a comprehensive study and then followed shortly thereafter with the zoning code update, oftentimes those are done more in unison. And so they do match up more closely, right? The future land use map, with the zoning map. But in instances where the time has passed, clearly here in this situation. Oftentimes when you go through the exhaustive process, as you mentioned, Dave, of updating the zoning code and updating the zoning map, you go through a little bit of a exercise of updating that future land use map, or using that future land use map as your base and asking the question, is this still valid? Is this future land use map still valid? Is it still accurately depicting the desired vision and uses for the community moving forward? And then if the answer is no, correcting those where those need to be corrected. And if the answer is yes, then keeping those as it relates to the zoning. Because again, two are completely are separate, but they speak to one another, right? So that's where that discussion, or I wanted to bring that up, because there are areas of, I don't want to call them conflict, because until you would go through each of the zoning cases and applications case by case, you really don't know if there is or isn't a conflict. But it could arise in discussion, both with Planning Commission and BZA and zoning and what have you, with respect to a potential applicant using the comprehensive plan and then it not necessarily speaking to what the zoning code is requiring, or vice versa. The zoning code may be less restrictive than what the desire is from the comprehensive plan or the future land use map. So it goes either way with respect to that.
Question, Maria Griffith. When we look at some of the others, the buildable land, the steep grades and that, it overlays, and you come up with the map on the right, we say, yeah, it makes sense, development over on the western side of town. And I'm just using this for an example, but let's say a certain percent of that when you drive through really isn't usable. It does have steep grades and water going through or that. So then that you see that discord between that and the zoning, because the zoning commission can look and say, well, that's kind of nice. I get the idea, but that's never going to happen type of thing. Do you see that a lot, or how do you reconcile some of that? No,
we have seen that in the past frequently. And sometimes in those situations, communities, the zoning map is really what's regulating the development. So in some situations, the communities will not address the future land use map. They'll leave it as is and hold steady with that. The zoning map is really what's going to guide them and direct the development. In other cases, some communities will take a step back and say, let's review our future land use map and let's put it more in alignment with our zoning district and how we want to grow or not grow or preserve, right? And make sure the two are a little bit more in sync. So that way, when cases come up and appeals are made by applicants, there's less room for argument. There's less room for applicants to come in and say, well, you mean this and I mean that, and having that back and forth. It's a little bit more straightforward. Does it solve all ills? Absolutely not. Nothing does. And if we can find something that does, we'd be in a great position as an industry and as a company to do that. But there's always going to be that discourse. But how can we minimize is what we're getting to? How can we minimize the conflict between the two? And again, either one. It could be addressing the zoning map to align or maybe better reflect the desire of the community, or it's the future land use map beginning to reflect better based on, Jim, you were mentioning before, if the future land use map is still relevant to today as we look at that.
Paul O'Neill. I just like a little perspective since we're talking about the left area. What's on the other side of the line? And what's that? Brunswick Township? And what is that zoned? Isn't that side like zoned industrial or commercial? And if the town lets the zoning map stand the way it is, will that just attract a lot of lower quality residential homes being built in that area?
That's a possibility. I don't know the specific answers yet to that question, Paul. I do know just from driving the corridor myself, at least in the city of Brunswick side, They have a few of those industrial parks and industrial businesses along that way. I do believe that there's still some residential homes there. I do not know, though, if those are grandfathered in, if those are zoned for future commercial or industrial development in the future. However, I think your point is well taken that especially as you look to the edges of your community, as we look at the edges of the township, understanding what's going on the other side of that edge can begin to inform what you do or what you would like to do on your side of the township. Again, without thinking too much into the minds of everyone who was involved in the 2015 plan, I begin to imagine that one of the reasons as you look at the future land use map up there, that there was the desire or the direction was, let's look at growth potentially along that West 130th corridor, had a large portion or a large fact to do with what's going on the other side of the township line. I'm just thinking of, the intersection of 303 and West 130th with the car dealership that's on the one corner, the Sheets development before that, Petiti's that was there. I forget now what it was, a Gales Garden Center, I think, when I first moved over there, across the street over there. So a lot of it does reflect. And you can see too, even if you go north of 303, I know that Brunswick has some additional industrial parks that are along the way there. And then it kind of converts back into residential or flips back to residential. So some of that is going to inform what's done on the other side, but it doesn't have to necessarily direct the vision or the desire of what the township wants to do with its property on their side of things.
Could I talk to
Okay.
Matt Riley? Just had a question or a couple questions. With respect to the map on the right, the extra commercial areas, that's generally basically from people putting little stickers where they think things would be. So could that be reflective of people who own parcels of land just advocating for their own parcel to be changed? Or
to answer your question, it could be. Yes, that could be a factor to it.
and generally when you build a comprehensive plan, is it seen as kind of like a guardrail so that individual property owners have the ability to go to the zoning commission and they can request changes to their own parcel because that's their right as a private property owner?
Can you elaborate a little bit more?
In terms of the framework, right? You said the vision, the blueprint, the framework. So, to Mr. Williams' question, are we moving, is there a plan to move to the map on the right? Isn't it more or less typically the undertaking of the property owner themselves to advocate for their own property and say, I would like my property zoned a certain way, rezoned a certain way?
Yes.
Rather than the township coming.
Yes, it does go both ways. So in the process that we've done in the past, in terms of comprehensive plan, it's a back and forth conversation, right? Of desire of what the township, what the officials may or may not want to see in terms of growth or preservation or protection, and then at the same time what the community wants to see. Community being the community at large, or community meaning the individual property owner. And as you indicated, the property owner still has that right to come to the zoning board and request a rezoning of their property if they so wish to. And in large part in those situations, these types of documents help assist to inform what that decision may or may not want to be in terms of that rezoning. Oftentimes, you don't want to zone a property out on an island all by itself as commercial, right? Next to residential. Yeah. Yeah.
Am I speaking out of turn? I don't know. Are we allowed to talk?
Good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because that's what I see also as you drive through some communities, right? And if you're watchful, like if you've been a developer, if you own land and stuff, whatever, or you just pay attention, right? You'll see where some communities have done a really bad job. And it's like you said, this is a simple map.
Yeah.
But some areas, they just, it's like a house next to a warehouse, and then it's just a free-for-all kind of deal.
And that's a good point to be made. And a lot of that goes back to this question of, is it the comprehensive plan or is it the zoning ordinance, right? Because as you talk about buffers and transitions, the comprehensive plan, and I believe in this next section, I'm going to go over some of the plan components and some of the goals and action items that were associated with the plan components. It talks about, looking into providing those buffers and revisiting the zoning code and how it relates to what the future land use is. But it's not going to regulate those buffer and transition zones, right? That goes to the zoning map, the zoning ordinances that ultimately regulate that.
Okay. I guess a follow-up on that, because I do see where a lot of times.
If I could just interrupt, Arthur, in the interest of.
I'm sorry, I don't know.
I'm Jack Swag.
I'm sorry, say it again? Sorry.
Jack Swag. I think it might be best to let him go through this presentation first to see where we're at as far as, and have the panel present their questions first. It might all come out to you at that point. And then if you still have questions after that, then we'll move forward with that, okay? Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
So as I was indicating, as I was starting to indicate here, the next part I just want to briefly touch on are the plan components. So these are the elements that ultimately formed the chapters of the comprehensive plan: land use, economic development, character and image, community services, and infrastructure and mobility. Under each one of these, what you'll see is what the goal statement of those plan components were. And I'll give some time for everybody to read it because I don't want to go through and just read everything verbatim to you. But these goal statements were developed with helping to, when questions arise in development proposals, with applications, with changes, to help guide some of that decision making ultimately. I know in some of the, Paul had asked before how we had helped previously, there was an application case when we were reviewing, giving our professional review of the application, not just with Hinckley Township, but with other municipalities that ask us to do an application review, as a zoning review, essentially, of a development proposal that's coming through. The first thing we look at right after the zoning code language is if the municipality, if the community has a comprehensive plan and what their, goal statements are in that plan. So looking at, as you talk about land use, what's their goal as it relates to land use? What's their goal in terms of economic development, and seeing if that proposal begins to kind of meet some of those goal statements. And so I'm going to kind of break down a few of these, and I've highlighted just a couple of ones that stood out to us, and kind of I asked the question of the steering committee, and this is going back to, I think, Brian and Jim, we were talking early on about, are we doing this or is this being done, right? So with the land use goal, it's talking about that a balanced land use pattern that ensures Hinckley's rural character is preserved and enhanced while carefully planning for growth and development. So that first objective over there is talking about promoting the rural low density development, and it has a few action items related to maintaining the 2-acre minimum, for example. One of the other action items under there that I highlight was encourage the incorporation of architectural standards as part of each conservation PUD development plan. So again, this is going back to the question of what are those conservation development standards that are outlined in the zoning code. So this action item is indicating we should look at that and make sure that the standards that are set out in that zoning code ordinance for the conservation development are in line with what the type of development is being sought after for the township. The last two at the bottom is what we were just talking about before, is growing consistently with the future land use map, and that action is talking about make sure that future development and zoning decisions support the implementation of that future land use map. So that's saying, again, how are the two maps communicating to one another? Again, the zoning map is regulating, but how is the future land use map informing that zoning map for the future? Character and image. Again, these are all the objectives and actions, but the one that stood out to us in terms of, as we were reviewing through things, was objective 1.3, in terms of establishing a design review district to guide the appearance and design of future development within the town center. Reason we're highlighting it there is, again, this is an objective and subsequent action items that could be part of a regulation related to the zoning district to ensure that any type of development that's happening in the town center, as identified in the comprehensive plan, is done so in the fashion that's desirable by the community, right? That could be that we don't want to promote too much development, but if changes are being made to existing structures, for example, that they're done in a context way that's sensitive to the surrounding area, right? So that we don't lose that existing character. So some of these items aren't even talking about future development per se. It's even talking about, improvements and updates to existing structures and areas that are currently, maybe at this time performing well. There's no changes going on with them, but new owner comes in and they, want to do something different. Does it align with what's going on right now and what wants to be maintained? So that's one that we highlighted. Further on in the character and image plan component, we talk about partnering with, or the objective, I should say, talks about partnering with local and regional organizations to develop a plan for future green space acquisition and easements. So if you start looking at some of those action items, that's talking about protecting kind of the existing forested and open land within Hinckley right now. That doesn't necessarily mean, let's expand the reservation, for example. That just could mean, looking at other tools, zoning and otherwise related, to put, conservation easements on them. So that way they can't be developed in the future. They stay as that kind of natural green space. That also goes back down to the other objective, 1.5, that was talking about protecting those natural corridors, specifically East Branch of the Rocky River and the Healy Creek. So again, it's talking these two right here are beginning to talk about preservation of land. What land do we want to protect and how do we want to do that? So these are some of those objectives we want to highlight for character and image. Economic development, promoting the small scale neighborhood business with a focus on serving the residents of Hinckley. What are ways, it's a very overarching statement. It's an overarching objective, but there are ways that we can do that in a regulation standpoint, either through the zoning code or otherwise, to make sure that we're maintaining that. Again, going back to another objective we highlight there, expanding commercial development opportunities. There's a variety of ways that can be done. It mentions it up there in the comprehensive plan, whether that's a JED, a joint economic development district, partnering, with the surrounding communities that border Hinckley Township. Is that still desirable, right? It's going back to a question I think, Jim, you mentioned. These are some of these objectives and action items that help to inform that future land use map and where those decisions are being made in terms of commercial properties, residential properties, right? So these are the things that stood out to us to say, clearly this was beginning to inform maybe that, proposed development along the western edge of the township. Is that still relevant right now? Is that still desirable? So sure, I'll join you. So this is just a draft of kind of our initial analysis looking through things. And the reason I say draft is because, we wanted to present this to the steering committee, to you all tonight. We want to get your feedback. It's a consistent process where we're going to continue to look at this as we go through this next phase to make sure that we've captured everything. We want to hear your comments. There may be something as we were kind of reviewing that we missed, or say, hey, Arthur, OHM team, can you take a further look into this part of the comprehensive plan because of XYZ and what have you. So these three things jump out to us right away. We talked about it before. Future land use and zoning maps not in alignment. So could be maybe a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, right? We were talking about how it can kind of go on both sides of the coin, but there could be the potential for issues as it relates to applications for commercial, industrial, and even residential. So how do we is there a desire to address that in some way? Is that updating, the zoning map? Is that reevaluating the future land use map, right? Is it a little bit of a combination of both? Could be. The second thing, and this gets to some of the questions that we had before, is the lack of specific design standards, which establishes a desired character and aesthetic. So again, this is kind of stepping out of the realm of reviewing the comprehensive plan and looking a little bit more closely at the zoning code. Some of the action items and objectives of this comprehensive plan talk about, as we were just mentioning before, the desire to set some standards to assist any type of development that comes forward, making sure that it's within the context and the desirability of the township, right? There's some things missing there. We'll talk about it in a little bit here too, when we talk about the review of the last meeting when we were talking about conservation development, what the requirements are in there, how they may not be matching, though the requirements in that matching what the desired outcome and goal of those conservation developments are supposed to be. The last thing is definition of rural character as it relates to the planning components. So I can say with all sincerity that we came up with this before we listened to the meeting last time, because I know this was a big topic about what defines rural character, right? The reason we brought this up in our analysis is that kind of term rural character is evolving, right? There's a lot of definitions. And then when I went back and watched the last meeting and viewed it, there's a lot more definitions that even I didn't even think about. And that's fine. That's okay. That's part of the growth process in a way, right? It is changing, but it doesn't mean that term is no good anymore. It just needs to be defined for Hinckley, right? I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit with that, and I won't do that so that way we stay on point here. But that's something that we talk about or want to talk about is when we talk about rural, because it's mentioned throughout the comprehensive plan. It mentions it, if I go back here a second, in character and image, right? The goal statement to the right, a unique and distinctive character that is preserved and strengthened by a district town center, the rural countryside, right? The scenic natural features and expansive park systems. I think if I go back even further, I think, yep, here it is in the land use, right? It's part of the goal statement for land use, a balanced land use pattern that ensures Hinckley's rural character is preserved and enhanced while carefully planning for growth and development. So it does call into question, what is that Hinckley rural character, right? So in summary, as we're standing together here, as we're talking together, those are kind of the three things that are standing out to us right now. So standing out to our OHM team that seems to be not in unison from the comprehensive plan based on some of the recent development proposals that have come forward. Is the future land use map and zoning maps not necessarily in alignment, the lack of specific design standards, and just that question of rural character. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here because I know there's going to be some questions about this and even back related to what we did in terms of the comprehensive plan audit. So what this is here, members of the steering committee and public, is just our summation of what we heard when we were watching and listening the last meeting. So you all came together, members of the public, presented some of their thoughts and their concerns, and you expressed some as well. So these were a couple of things that stood out to us. One, what is the identity of Hinckley and how is that defined? I think that was a big topic of conversation early on, the conversation about rural, about bedroom community. You know, what is the standard the Webster definition? What's the definition of each member within the community, right? And all of that kind of is not necessarily in alignment, but it's a conversation piece. Conservation developments and the associated standards. We already started talking about that right now at the beginning of this meeting, but that was a big topic of conversation. Question about minimum lot sizes under R1 and R2 as it stands right now. Question about where should development occur? Are there standards? Should there be standards associated with that development? Senior housing, Jim, I think you had brought that question up early on, the question of senior housing. And then one of the other topics was the water and sewer infrastructure and the potential impacts. Just quickly to address some of these, and then we'll open it up for steering committee members for questions based on what you've heard from me so far. We'll talk about the identity portion. We'll talk about here in a second the conservation developments and minimum lot sizes. As it relates to senior housing, I mean, it comes down to, is there a desire for it? Comprehensive plan talks about it. I think we were talking about it early. Is that still a desirable development type? That's one question. And, you know, if the answer is yes, what does that look like? If the answer is no, is the concern the development quality? Is it the development density? There's some things that could be unpacked with that to see what is really at the crux of that question about senior housing. If it ultimately is decided that maybe that's not something that's desirable here, that's quite all right, but it was something that needs to be addressed because it was brought up as a key theme as part of the comprehensive plan. The water and sewer infrastructure, I'll tell you right now, the comprehensive plan doesn't necessarily say, hey, we want it. It has some language in there that's talking about what do you do if you have it. The comprehensive plan, again, is that blueprint, is that vision. So the intention with talking about the impacts of water and sewer infrastructure is to get out ahead if that's a desirable infrastructure implementation that the township wants to proceed on. If the township decides that it doesn't want to proceed on that, then those elements that talk about, what do you do if more water and sewer comes in and what does that mean for development, that kind of just falls by the wayside, honestly. When we develop our comprehensive plans, we want to look comprehensively and look at all potential growth options and make sure that the community, and in this case, Hinckley Township, is in the right position that if that type of infrastructure were to come forward, that you are all prepared for the impacts and what comes along with it with respect to that. So the comprehensive plan, even though it talks about it, does not necessarily say, okay, now that it's talked about in the comprehensive plan, so it shall be done, right? That ultimately comes down to a trustee decision. It comes down to a community decision. It's not a comprehensive plan says it, so it has to happen. Again, it's trying to look ahead, look to the future and say, if it does happen, what does that mean for Hinckley Township? How can we ensure that it has the type of impact that's desired by the community? The other 2 points I want to bring up, and it's talking about going back to the identity, right, and how it's defined, is in there. One of the activities and questions that was part of the 2015 comprehensive plan was asking the question, what do you treasure most about Hinckley? And so this is taken directly from the plan, from the public input section. And I highlighted the top 5 answers that talk about rural and low density and farms. Talks about the parks, both Metro Park and other green spaces. Openness, talks about community environment, small town feel, and also talks about, the size of the residential lots. So I think Jim and Brian, you were bringing this up earlier on in terms of the questions of, maybe this is a good question to ask. Does this still hold true today? If we were to ask this question of the community and we say, members of Hinckley Township, members of the community here, what do you treasure most about Hinckley? Do those elements still line up with what is heard the most? Is there more, as I said up there, is there more that should be added or that ultimately get raised higher? And I think this is one of several questions that can be asked of the community, asked of the steering committee as well, to help inform that question of what is the identity of Hinckley and how is it defined? Ultimately, how are we defining rural? Right? What is that rural character of Hinckley? The last thing I will bring up, which was our topic early on, was the conversation about conservation development. So the intent, and we're talking about just overall intent and not necessarily what's on the books yet for conservation development in Hinckley. The overall intent of this development is to preserve, or the conservation development is to preserve open space, whether that's general open space or forested space. Whatever the case may be, it is to preserve as much open space as you possibly can. Now, in the traditional residential development, which is that graphic to the left, and we use this often when we're working on zoning code updates to try to explain this to members of the public and steering committees. If you do not have a conservation development and you have a large tract of land, the 100-acre minimum, the 50-acre minimum, whatever the acreage minimum may be within that specific community, oftentimes you could see a more spread out development like you see up there. You may see a closer and more dense development like you would typically see like in a Strongsville or even a Brunswick or closer to Cleveland, right? Those types of communities. So you would see that traditional type of residential development. On the right, in theory, is what a conservation is trying to do. You can see that there's more open space / forested space that is preserved. Now, you'll see that development that's there, and you'll say to me, well, Arthur, that's a pretty dense development that you're showing there. That's true. We're just kind of showing a general development, not saying that this is what every conservation development needs to be. But what helps set the success, the factor that plays a role into the success of the conservation development is the development standards for those parcels. So as we're talking here, you could get that kind of acreage minimum buffering setback that you can kind of see on the left with the traditional residential development, with still preserving that open space on the right. So what I'm saying, and I think, Paul, we were talking about this before in that question, is that it's not just necessarily, in our opinion, the conservation development is either good or bad. It comes down to what are the requirements, the design standards, the setbacks, the frontage buffering, the landscaping requirements, right? What are those elements that are within the zoning code that help dictate how the rest of that land that is going to be developed residential going to look like? So ultimately, that was what really plays the role in it. Now, again, as we talk about this, maybe just having that and having those options, and because there's law history to your heart's content that talk about disputes and cases that go on with these conservation develops, that it's something that, in the future now for Hinckley Township don't want to deal with. We want to maintain just our standard development, and then we'll move forward from there. But if it is determined that, okay, we want to try to preserve as much open space as we possibly can, whatever that percentage is. I think, Jim, you had mentioned on the books right now, it's basically, I think 50% of that 100 acres is what the minimum is. It's a 100-acre minimum for the conservation development.
200.
100. And then 50% of that, right?
You said that, you said 200.
I was wrong. It's 100.
So that's what that percentage is right now. So in order to try to maintain that, that's what it's ultimately trying to do. So it could be those other factors that I'm talking about: setbacks, what the minimum front, rear, side yard setbacks are, landscaping standards, frontage, so on and so forth. That could be playing into a role why the conservation development is not being as successful or not developing in the way that I think was maybe initially envisioned for that type of development. The last point, no, I think that is it. So when we talk about, I think from the last time, about the minimum lot sizes and where should development occur, again, that's it's starting to creep into the realm of the zoning code and potential updates to the zoning code. But that's why we're here and having this discussion. So it goes back to the purpose of this plan audit, as opposed to going through and doing an extensive and expensive comprehensive plan overview or overhaul, right? Let's talk about what the real issues are and where those issues can be addressed. Potentially, they could be addressed in the future land use map. Potentially, it's setting up or revisiting or re-examining the zoning code and some of the standards that are outlined in there. Maybe it's creating some additional standards, some design standards, landscaping standards, what have you, to add to the zoning code or to add as an amendment to the comprehensive plan to help guide future development. So that's my spiel so far. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
We're going to take a 5-minute break for our court reporter. 7:55.
I'll keep my hand up.
We'll make sure, Paul, you're first.
Good. How are you? This is really busy. Yeah. Well, right. So you're getting so I wear a lot of I'm the school liaison, so we have 16 districts. And I'm basically their contract liaison. And their staffs, which
We're good, Arthur.
We're good? Okay.
Floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So just a couple of quick points before we get into the discussion. One, we'll be sending this presentation out, and it can be made available not only for the steering committee, but for members of the public. My contact information will be associated with it, so feel free to contact me via email to answer or ask any additional questions that you may have as it relates to the presentation and what we're doing here. The last point of clarification as we go into this discussion point, steering committee members, just a reminder to make sure you identify yourself before you ask your question. So with that, Paul, I have to put out my picture of the dog. It's not my dog, but I just love this picture of the dog as part of discussion. So.
Okay, thank you, Paul O'Neill. I was wondering if you could go back to
I'll get rid of the dog.
the slide where the two maps are talking.
Oh, yeah. Excuse me, flashing through here quickly. But yes. Oh, too many.
Okay, that's a nice one.
It's
Okay, and I want to tie this into the last part of your discussion about conservation and all that. When I looked at when you had the conservation slide up, it looked like, okay, this is conservation, it's all geometry based, it's okay. If I was a real estate developer, I'd want to minimize how much I had to spend on roads and utilities, and that's the way I would do it. Okay, but I don't know if that necessarily serves the people of Hinckley. And I mean, I'm looking at the map on the right, I'm looking down at that bottom right-hand side. That's mostly the park.
Yeah, that's the Hinckley Reservation.
And
That's the Hinckley Reservation down
I
there.
think this plan really has neglected that major asset in the town. That's an asset. I think some of the remaining golf courses and farms are assets in the town too that really haven't been addressed by the plan on the right. But let's go to the park. There have been other conservation plans in other states and other towns. One that came to mind is a place called Wellington, Florida. And anybody here is a horse person? Could I have a raised hand? Have you heard of Wellington, Florida? Okay, so in Wellington, Florida, you have conservation developments where hold on. Conservation developments like McLean Ward lives in, where people ride their horses down the street, and they hook up to riding trails. And we have a lot of horse people in this town. We have a metro park where you can ride horses, and in Wellington, you have people that are spending $10 million, $50 million, $20 million in homes to be in that conservation development. And I think that, why can't we leverage the assets of the town to improve the quality of the town? Lift it up, take advantage of it, leverage it. The same thing can be, you put a plan, the conservation where all the houses were clustered together. I've seen plans, conservation plans, where all the homes are clustered around the golf course. And they're not dense. And people spend a lot of money to go look out that fair line, the fairway. How do you address that in a plan? I don't know. I'm not a professional.
Yeah, and
I'm wondering if are there any good examples of conservation plans that we can discuss or evaluate rather than just use the one that developers would like us to use?
no, Paul, that's a good comment. And I think as we were, again, the comprehensive plan talks about the use of conservation districts, right? Whereas the zoning code is what's going to regulate it and effectively shape how that conservation development is going to look. So this starts to raise the question of going back between the zoning ordinance and the comprehensive plan, if the comprehensive plan advocates for the use of conservation development where appropriate and even begins to outline like it's doing right now in the future land use map, the areas in that green with the outline it's what's being called out for as that residential for conservation, effectively using that conservation district as a means to regulate it. If that's still desirable, but it ultimately comes down to how that conservation development is being applied and what are the regulations, that goes back to, okay, comprehensive plan, yes, you have it correct right now that we want to use it, but we have to go look at the zoning code and those regulations and get that desired look that you're talking about.
I think we're at the cusp where you might have the opportunity right now to do that, but it's not going to be around much longer because everything north of us is pretty much tacked out into your cookie cutter, Pulte, Ryan Homes, okay?
Right.
That's probably what Hinckley's going to look like unless you shape it with, architectural, put a little thought into how you want it to, have an incentive that if you do this, you can have something nice.
Yeah, I will say quickly, just to finish that, to finish your point, Paul, we solely focus more on the comprehensive plan in this initial analysis. Obviously, as we are explaining some of our initial summaries, our initial thoughts, there's a lot of question that comes into how this is relating back to the zoning code, which is ultimately regulating those standards. So I will say that in this next phase and our next step, that we are going to take a little bit more of a look at the zoning code and how it reflects back to the comprehensive plan as it relates to those regulations. We admittedly took a brief overlook of the conservation development to have an idea of what those requirements are. But as we're looking at this comprehensive plan, it seems to be shifting, based on some of the development proposals that have come through, the objections of those proposals, that is it a question of, do we want development? Yes or no? And then if the answer is yes, how do we regulate that to have it look and feel the way we want? So getting that desirable outcome at the end of the day, right? And setting those parameters so that way it looks and feels the way that the township wants that type of development to look and feel.
Thank you.
Paul Easterling. I want to build on Paul's question about how it relates to your scope of work. Is part of your scope of work to provide benchmark communities or aspirational communities to the steering committee to give us representations of what communities have done for conservation land, business development, small rural communities, to give us ideas of where Hinckley may want to go? Paul's done the work and looked at Wellington down in Florida, but would that be something that's part of the scope of work that you would give to us to give us guidance further on?
Short answer is yes. So as part of the recommendations that we would give, depending on what those are, we would want to provide that additional guidance to say, if it's coming down to a question of the regulations and the zoning, to give examples of, look, Hinckley Township, here are some of those examples, other communities, other townships, villages, what have you, that have gone about it in a similar fashion that you all are expressing the desire to have as it relates to that in particular, or even to any of the recommendations, whether it's the future land use, the question surrounding the rural character, right? So I think towards the middle of this process, we're going to have a good idea of kind of some of the key issues. I think we've already started to have a good idea of what the key issues are, but really begin to cement those as it relates to what could be done with the comprehensive plan or even the zoning regulations as it relates to those two, because those two are kind of informing one another. And as I was saying before, they're just not speaking together in the right fashion. And it seems, at least right now, that there's a few more issues related to the zoning regulations. Again, where we stand right now, that's yet to be confirmed. But where we're at right now seems to be a few more issues in the the zoning regulations and standards as opposed to the comprehensive plan itself. There's still some factors in there, but that's just where the tide looks to be shifting right now. But that can change.
Maria, a little more to build, but to throw in back to that identity thing, because you're right, we had a lot of discussion over what is the definition and what is Hinckley. And I did a lot of kind of digging and looking through. And one thing I will say, when it comes to the rural and a bedroom community is one where the people who live there, more of them work outside the community than the community. You can have a rural bedroom community. You can have a suburban bedroom community. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. You know, when I look, you can have something like a Maple Heights, which is very close in on the east side and very small Parma type houses, but it's mostly houses. There isn't much industry. And that's a very suburban bedroom community. You can come out here and we may be a bedroom community, but we have that rural. But then it's the word you use, character, and that definition of rural. You know, again, a lot of it is that density and that keeping that separate. But then you have to look at how you build your town. And I'll use Hudson as an example. And again, I think it goes more back into zoning, but they are very strict with what type of house you can build. You can't just go in and build a really modern house or decide I want to build a farmhouse. It's got to be the Western Reserve. And even their buildings, when they're building a commercial building, and that's how they've taken the character and kept it. So if your definition of rural is more, and I was speaking to one of the other members here, the breakup, Mayberry RFD, you know, to use an example or something, then just the spacing alone isn't going to do it. And maybe this is where we're running into some of our issues with this conservation zoning is some people are looking at it strictly from space, others are looking at it from the design perspective, and we need to maybe get a real, even more of a feel for the community on what we're looking for with rural, because certainly if you look at the signs, everyone's got a sign, we want to keep it rural, but they may all have a different thought as to what that means.
And I think you bring an excellent point up that there's a lot of definitions for it, Webster, personal, what have you. I think what's important is that the definition is created for Hinckley Township, whatever that is. The example that I can use in this is that we assist the village of Boston Heights in Summit County. I would consider parts of that village rural. There are elements that they have put in to assist in making sure that they maintain a rural character as it's defined by the village of Boston Heights. And I think that last part is critical, as it's defined by that community, right? Whatever that is. They're in a situation where they have Route 8 that's running through. They identified, that Route 8 corridor and that area around what is Heinz Hill as that's the area where we're going to have development. That area and along the Chittenden Road corridor, which borders Route 8. They say that's where we're going to develop, right? If we're going to have development, just there. Anywhere else, it's residential, right? That residential has standards. It has minimum lot acreage. Actually, you have a higher minimum lot requirement than they do. They have a 1.5 minimum lot acre. Most of the homes are more than that. There's still a collection of ones that are at that minimum, but most are higher than that. But they also have design standards, not only for landscaping within those residential areas. So the residential developments that are developed, they have a buffering zone and a landscaping zone, for the entrances. So that way it's not as visible coming down the corridor. It still keeps that kind of, again, in their definition, rural character. And then even within those commercial zones, they have an entire design standard for the aesthetic that's there. Recently, their Akron Children's Hospital went in there on Route 8. They use that same, as you said, that Hudson does. They border Hudson. So that Western Reserve style of architecture, there's landscaping standards. Even with they had a large industrial development, our house furniture that went there. And I was not working with OHM at the time that was going through application. But from the stories that I had spoken with and heard from my colleagues, one of the big issues was that bordering of residential, because just to the north of that continues residential property. And so they had I think it's 100 or 150 foot setback from the roadway along Heinz Hill and the residential edge, and they had to mound and buffer with an assortment of trees and species there. So that way that buffering was maintained even during our long, cold winters here in Northeast Ohio. So that's an example of, to your point, of regulations and guidelines that can be put into place to help define that. So that way it's not kind of an ambiguous term, that as each application comes forward, any developer could say, yeah, we're keeping that rural character, we're doing this, right? And that, whatever that is, could mean something different for me, to you, to, the general public, to the neighbor, what have you, right? So by kind of establishing that, they, in that specific example of the Village of Boston Heights, help define that. They say, this is what we as the community are defining as rural, and these are the standards that are associated with that to help define that. Other questions from the committee? Sorry. Other questions from the steering committee? And I think from the steering committee, if you wanted to take questions from the public.
The existing plan or ideas that you want at this point?
Both.
I want to comment a little bit about, I think, and I'm going to skip some of the stuff because you've addressed it, but a suggestion I have when it comes to the survey. I think, the goal of this survey is to get in as many hands as many people as possible, let the results drive the direction of this committee and the township going forward. There's going to be some challenges. One of the things, we have a very diverse community, older, younger, different communication methods. So how do we get it in as many people's hands as possible? And we have to ensure that the responses are from Hinckley residents and that each person, kind of just submits a single response. And we have to do it timely. We really are on a timeline here. So my suggestion is going to be we develop the survey, offer it electronically, accept email responses with authentication of some fashion, and in-person drop-off. There's been volunteers in the community that have already said that they would be able to step up and help someone here, whether it be at buzzer days or whatever areas we're going to collect the surveys, that they would come for a period of time and we rotate people through to collect this information. If the population's over 8,000 now, if it targets at least 10 to 15% response rate, I know that's high for a survey, but that would truly, I believe, give us a good feeling in the direction of the community. The goal would also be to develop the right number of questions. There's free services you can do online. You have a max of 10 questions. Can we get everything within 10 questions? I don't know. But we have to allow for maybe some succinct answers, but open feedback from people on what do you truly desire. Are there other things we haven't taken into consideration? There's been discussions that have come up about rental properties, short-term, long-term, multi-home housing, apartments. Does the community want to entertain or encourage alternative energy in the future? Or, how do we handle that? So I think the goal of this is let's get to as many people as possible to ensure that we're getting accurate results, but get it out in a variety of formats, not just limited to email or in-person drop-off. We have a lot of communication methods built in the township today, whether it be email, the newspapers, the board up front. So I think we take advantage of all that and develop something that truly lets us get a response that we want.
And Jim, to that point, that's where, we as OHM, are looking to you all, as we were talking about before, the steering committee, in terms of that role of assisting to get that communication out and identifying members of the community who can further assist to get that information out and get that survey response increased as much as possible, right? I think the number of questions, this is an ongoing internal debate within our studio of what the right number of questions is. And a lot of it, in my opinion, plays in one of the elements that plays into that are the type of questions, how many open-ended questions you have versus multiple choice. There are certain questions, I think, even in as we're looking at this audit, that lend itself to wanting to be more open-ended because you want to be able to see what the general response is and then bring those together and find a commonality in all of them, right? There can be some multiple choice type questions, but sometimes those are limited obviously in how you can respond because you're only given so many options. But I think that there could be a good balance of those. We tend to shoot for, I think, given the size and the nature of what we're looking at in this audit, I think somewhere between 10 and 15 questions is reasonable, and is just overall, I think, the right size, because some of the questions that you had mentioned, and we have, as we're talking about the community survey, we have some suggested questions that we want to share with you as a steering committee. I would suggest and advise that you also ask for members of the community to share suggested questions with you as well, so we can come to a consensus on what those questions are. Some of them are open-ended, but all of them are really looking at how is this comprehensive plan working now, and what is it that we need to do, right? That's ultimately the end goal as part of our process, is to understand what is working or not working with this comprehensive plan, and what is the recommendation that we want to give to you as a steering committee, and ultimately rise it to the level of the trustees to say, okay, this is what we feel needs to get done in order to shape the vision. Now, some of that may be, we need to do a larger and more expansive kind of outreach and discussion with the community, right? It may be part of the recommendation of, in this time frame and given the circumstances, we need to have a more robust conversation with everybody in the community. That could be one of those recommendations. And maybe that's found as part of doing this survey, right? Because there's just a lot of questions to be asked. Some of them are outside what we're looking at as it relates to the comprehensive plan. Maybe some of them are more related to zoning and the ordinances and guidance that's in there, right? So even going through this community survey process and figuring out what those right questions are could help us understand what the right recommendation might be at the end of this.
Thank you. Kenton Grimes, I have a question related to the survey. So I'm thinking of back when we did the survey in 2015. Any value in duplicating that survey from the standpoint of seeing trends or seeing how we talked about the evolution of the term rural? Do we see basically by presenting the similar or very, a facsimile of what we did before, if we see a trend in shifting of the opinion, by point, is there value in that? Or is there value in at least finding key questions off of that first survey that need to be repeated?
I think it's the latter. And some of the suggestions that we have, at least right now, are taking some of those questions that were asked in that survey. I recall hearing from the past meeting that there was some heartburn over how that engagement took place and the question of whether or not that was expansive enough and really reached out to the entire community. So I wouldn't say just taking that survey and duplicating it, because things have changed from that point too. But I think there are some questions that were asked. We brought up what do you treasure? Clear's not working. What do you treasure in Hinckley? I think there was a question, if I recall, in there about, what do you treasure most about Hinckley? That was a direct question from the survey. I think there was another question related to rural and what that meant at that time. So questions like that from the previous comprehensive plan and that survey, I think are relevant to bring up. But I think going back, Jim, to your point, there's some new questions that I think can be raised. It could be the simple question about conservation development, whether that's something that's desirable or not, and maybe putting, some disclaimers on it that if we were to move forward with it, revising maybe some of those requirements to better align with that rural character that we're trying to get the answer to. But again, going back to Jim, what we were talking about, it's that balance of what are the right number of questions and the type of questions, because that rural and treasure this treasure question was an open-ended question. So that list is the summary of what were the common themes that we're seeing in the responses, right? So it's kind of finding that right balance between them. But I think looking at those previous questions and applying them so you can look back would be something we would recommend. Absolutely.
Paul O'Neill, I believe that if the survey is done, you should probably have questions that are going to be meaningful to you as a planner. Otherwise, we can do a survey, give you a bunch of data, you don't know what to do with it, or it doesn't need to be hanging from the perspective of the plan.
Correct. That's where the back and forth between community recommending certain questions, you all hearing those recommendations, you as a steering committee having some questions, and then our team, the OHM team, providing that professional guidance to say, these questions are kind of relevant to what we're looking at. And maybe these questions are good questions to ask and could be part of another survey that's maybe starting to talk about, what's going on in the township right now. So it kind of goes back to Jim, what I was saying, could be a recommendation that we're seeing all these questions that we want to ask, and we can say, okay, this group is a set of relevant questions to what we're trying to do here with respect to the comprehensive plan audit, but there's still a lot of valid questions that are kind of outside that scope. So maybe it is, looking into developing a fuller survey as part of this recommendation to look into those other issues and those other questions that are outside of that comprehensive plan audit scope. So it's not to discount those other questions. It's just to say, those are great questions. Doesn't fit necessarily what we're trying to get at here, but they definitely need to be asked with the community. And that's something that could be done in the future.
Hi, Tom Schrader. First, apologize for my tardiness earlier. Significant response. What would we expect in a 8,500 person population?
Well, a lot of that comes down to the methodology and how you do it. Those types of the surveys that we often do are not statistically valid surveys, just because of the nature of how we put the surveys together, and because of the cost factor. Those statistically valid surveys, we've done them in other comprehensive plans, and depending on the community size, just the survey alone can range from $10,000 to $20,000 to do because of the methodology. So those really come down to the methodology. That's why the surveys we do, it's not statistically valid, right? Because it's a little bit more makeshift, it's a little more community oriented. I think as Jim pointed out, it's reaching out to members of the community, asking them to push out, right? Going through common channels of communication, whether that's on social media, the township website, flyers, right, event days, things of that nature. So I think in our situation, I think Jim, the goal that Jim mentioned about that 10 to 15% is a good goal to try to reach. But if we want a more statistically valid survey, I think that's one of those things that we talk about as a recommendation for this, because there's a lot more nuance that's involved in it. And I won't pretend to know all the little nuances in that. We have there are team members on our team that have performed those, but we also have company friends who do that every day of the week and twice on Sunday sometimes. So that's something though that I'll make a note of it to kind of reach out to them to just get a general sense of what their typical methodology is for that. And if that's something that might be, I think one of the questions was, with the recommendations, I think, Paul, you were asking that, like with the recommendations, would we show some examples of things of other design types or areas as it relates to the rural character? So if a recommendation is let's do a statistically valid survey or a more expansive survey, we can show some examples of other communities who have done that and what their results were and what their methodology was to do so.
So to follow up, then, do you think that you guys as a group would have a reasonable expectation of what response would be based on the kind of survey we're likely to, based on the vehicle we're likely to use to get it to the?
I think for us, between 5 and 10% for our non-statistically valid is one that we feel fairly good about. I would say it kind of depends about the size of the community. I think for Hinckley Township, I would want to shoot for the 10% personally. We also take into account too the meetings that we hold. So these meetings with you all as the steering committee that the public can attend. The ability to, as I was mentioning before, with members of the public being able to reach out to us to ask questions and converse, right? That takes into a part of kind of our survey response as well. So that's why too. And again, I was not there back in 2015. Again, dad brain, I have no idea where I was in 2015. I don't even know where I was last week, quite frankly. That may be an issue down the road. But as I was looking through that chapter, I don't know how much those public meetings and those other elements also played into a role of summarizing. I know there was a couple of questions about, what those results were in the public input. So it's hard for me to say without talking to the individuals who were there or those of you who were there, how that factored in as well.
So comparing it to other communities that you work with, would 5 to 10% be a realistic expectation?
Especially in the time frame that we would try to do this in, I would say so. Yes, and I was saying in the break, even when we do these statistics, even when we partner and do the statistically valid surveys, or we're in larger communities or have a larger time frame, the first kind of 2 weeks that you put out the survey is where you see the greatest response, and then oftentimes it's forgotten about and it kind of just plateaus. And then you put out that reminder and you get a short, little spike again, and then it kind of fades away. It also goes to individuals, members of the community who are most interested and want to be involved, like all of you here in the room are coming to these types of meetings, right? Yes, there's others who can't attend all the meetings, so they're captured. And they're usually the ones that are captured in that initial outreach and initial response to the community survey. I think there was a comment or just a discussion had at the last meeting about, wanting to have seen, more individuals, attend or be involved in it too. And, obviously sometimes it's other factors at play. So usually you'll capture those in that community survey and that initial push. And then you'll capture the people who forget things like that, like myself. You can ask my wife, in that second push when you put out that other reminder and say, okay, this is the last week or a couple more days left, right? And you'll get that last push of individuals responding to it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On these surveys, I'm sure your company has performed, well, what you say is they performed before. Any way we can look at some of the questions your company might have asked in the past?
Absolutely. I think our intention is, as a next step after our meeting today, is not only to share obviously the presentation with the steering committee, but also kind of share our initial kind of list of questions that we're thinking about right now that would seem reasonable to ask. And to share that with you, and then to take that with questions that you all come up with and that are suggested by the public to essentially kind of whittle that down to the ones that are relevant to what our discussion and our purpose is with respect to this comprehensive plan audit. And that's where I was going back to Paul about if there are other questions that are kind of outside that scope but seem valid to ask, that's something that, maybe down the road, having a larger survey, more expansive survey might be necessary to help further inform other decisions within the township that's outside of what we're doing here.
Thank you.
Jacob Studer. Since obviously the conservation is a big part of the discussion here, would it make sense to give you feedback? And don't have a direct opinion on this, but what are the displeasures with what's going on with the current ones that could be conveyed to you, so that if we're asking a question on the survey or if we need to talk about it in zoning, I would assume that would assist you, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe that's
Yes.
an avenue of the things for people that
Yeah.
have a concern about conservation areas. Okay, I think we have 3 of the areas are what they deem difficulty or problems.
Mm-hmm.
If we can summarize that and say, okay, how can we make this better?
Yeah. And even and Jake, to that point, even outside the survey, just as a response to the steering committee and as part of this process, just stating, as you mentioned, there's 3 conservation districts in the township, and these are my reasons why I'm not in favor of them moving forward as a tool because of X, Y, and Z. And we can take that answer and understand what it really comes down to, right? What we've seen, and I'm not saying that's the case here in Hinckley Township, but what we've seen, it often comes down to the regulations within the conservation development, whether that's setbacks, landscaping, at the end of the day, it's not ultimately the conservation development, but how it's being done is what really is the crux of the issue. That may be the case here. It may be just, you know what, we don't want to use that tool. We just want to have our basic zoning regulations for the 2 acre minimum and the regulations that fall under that R1 zoning district or R2 for those other districts, which is perfectly fine, right? And I think that's part of this conversation, right? Because if that's the case, it's one of those things that we would recommend of, let's look at maybe redoing the future land use map and removing that conversation about conservation districts out of the map. And I think we had pointed out that even in the plan components for land use, it was one of those strategy, one of the actions to do in using conservation developments, right? To, I think it was maintain the rural character or the larger lot sizes. So maybe that's something that's stricken from that part. So that way it's known as developments coming in that, to residential developers, that's not what we want to do here, right? Or if it is with those enhancements and those adjustments to it, we're okay with it, but you have to do it in our fashion. Just quickly on that, going back to the Village of Boston Heights example, the standards that they have with that, I know just in my time working with that community, and it's been 3 years. Wow. It's been 3 years. I know that there have been, 4 or 5 development proposals that have come through that just did not meet the requirements, and the Planning Commission and Zoning Board. I distinctly remember the one meeting, the chair threw down the design requirements and said, "You're not meeting them. You meet those, we'll talk. If you don't want to meet them, we're not open for discussion." So that's one aspect that helps with those types of things, because to me it sets the floor, right? It sets here's the floor that we're willing to accept, right? If you want to go above and beyond that, great, but you got to meet this first before we have a discussion.
Paul O'Neill, just to follow on with your thought there, are there any conservation developments in Boston Heights that have gone through that we can actually drive out there and look at? Can you identify those to us so we can?
Yes, I can. When I send, I'll make a note, and when I send that email out to you all with a presentation, I will give you the names of those that have been developed. I will give out the names of those developments for the residential.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another comment from Richard Pearl, from Richard Pearl, who's a part of your committee, and I didn't think it was that long on my screen on my computer, but then when I printed it, it's a 2, maybe 3-page endeavor with pictures. So I'm going to just forward it to you so you have it as a committee. Arthur, when we talked at the break, were you open to taking some questions from the public, or are you at your limit?
I'm open to take a few questions if the committee is good with that. I want to be sensitive to everybody's time here this evening. Again, the presentation will be shared. You're happy to reach out to me by email or my office line, and we can have a conversation if you have a specific question related to any of the topics that we talked about tonight, or a specific issue that you might have. But I would also encourage you, again, I'm open and willing to talk, but I'd also encourage you to speak to the members of the steering committee as well. That's why we have kind of these processes, because you all of you here, minus myself, I live on the other side of town, or on the border side. But you all are residents here and know what's happening and what's going on. So that's why we set up these processes, even our regular comprehensive planning or master planning, where we have a steering committee, we have members of the public, and we have ourselves as the planning and design professionals, where we can all offer our points of view and our opinions on the matter. But again, you all live here, experience it every day, know what's going on a lot better than I do, even though I do drive through quite frequently. So I do see what's going on in this case, but we also want to just encourage the conversation between the steering committee and the public, but we're willing to also address items as well. So.
Susan Morrison.
Say it one more time, sorry.
Susan Morrison. First of all, congratulations, Jim and Arthur, for your emphasis on the survey, which I feel is very important, and how. I would like to see someone at your company who knows how to write a survey, question properly, work with us to do it. There are questions and there are questions. And sometimes how they are worded steers the answer or confuses the answer. When did you stop beating your wife? It's like, when did you stop doing Number two, one set of terminology we've been using again and again is confusing me. We have comprehensive plan, we have zoning regulations, and we have this holy land use map. As I see it, the comprehensive plan is the Bible, and the zoning is the 10 Commandments, and the land use is like a parable. It's not law. It's like a story about, gee, it would be nice if we could do this. That's how I understand it. And I don't know if that's correct or not.
I don't think I've ever heard it described that way, but I like it described that way. That's no, the zoning, to respond to that, the zoning regulations are the regulations. Those are the laws. So that's what has to be abided by. The comprehensive plan, like you mentioned, it's a vision. It's what you as a community desire to grow into or be like, right? It would be like me telling my parents that I want to be a pastry chef, but the reality is I just want to eat the pastries, right? Not be an actual chef. But that's my goal. But the reality is I have to actually go to school to do it, right? So the zoning regulations are what govern what happens. So you're absolutely right. The comprehensive plan is giving that blueprint, giving that vision, and it's helping to inform that zoning regulations, but it doesn't have to. As we were talking about before, right now that zoning map and that future land use map don't speak the same language right now fully. So doesn't mean that that's what has to happen, but it does help inform that. So I think your understanding of it is correct between them.
I'm wondering about the potential. Sorry. Oh, Chris Stewart, STUDOR. I'm wondering about the potential to get a perspective on, since we've spent so much time on conservation development, what percentage of the total buildable land in Hinckley should even be a conservation district? Looking at the fact, if we can only, since it has to be 100 acres, if we can only get one or two more possible conservation developments in the township, is too much time being spent on that versus all the other types of developments. Let's just say that we can get one more conservation development in the township because we only have one plot of 100 acres, or maybe only two, possibly three. And are we neglecting to look at all the other types of housing, the 2-acre minimum lot? We're spending all this time on this, but is the majority of developable housing land really 2-acre plots? I'm wondering.
It's a good question to ask. When you talk about the 100 acres, it doesn't mean that the parcels can't start, slowly and surely being mixed and brought together. So based on the lay of the land right now, we could determine how many of those conservation developments could happen or could come forward in the future. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, again, those individual parcels can't be purchased and started to be combined together to meet that acreage minimum.
Just all the regular 2-acre development amenities and zoning laws just be ignored and
Correct.
don't take a look at
And-
it. But I would like to see done with 2-acre lots.
Correct. And the guidance and design that could be brought to the conservation development could be also mirrored in the 2-acre minimums. Not everything, but certain aspects, because it is a good question. I mean, if you go around and you see, I mean, there could be 2-acre lots that also aren't meeting kind of the spirit of the rural character, right? And again, the question comes, is that the setback, right? Is that the landscaping standards? It could be a couple of different things or a combination of things. And then it goes back to what the definition for Hinckley Township, and I keep stressing that because I think that's important, what the definition of the rural character is for Hinckley Township. Because I think in the last meeting, and I think some of the steering committee members were looking up on the spot too, what the definition, the Webster definition is. That's just the standard definition, but you all as members of the community for the township should ultimately define what that means for you. Just quickly, another plan that we worked on down in the Columbus area in Pataskala, they were constantly using that rural definition. And they strictly defined it, meaning open space and agriculture. They wanted to maintain, they have several farms down there. They wanted to maintain those. They wanted to attract more farms. So they clearly defined in their plan, when they talked about rural and maintaining the rural character of Pataskala, they clearly defined what that meant to them, right? And not just kind of leaving it ambiguous to anyone's type of definition.
You have a question right there?
Oh, yes.
I just have one real quick. Would you tell me your name? Yes, Nancy Mandalakis, Mandilakis. And I just want to talk off of your point over there, and I'm sorry, Doctor, I think her point about making it, I don't know if you used Hudson, I'm going to use Hudson, the atmosphere. And I don't know what the zoning codes are. Carl, you probably know because you just renovated the donut shop. You know, do we have things in place? And is this something we need to write in the plan that, oh, if you're going to be in this little strip of Hudson, you need to have those little cornices, or if that's what it's called, or some type of ornamental display that shows the ambiance of it. That's what I would like to see. But yeah, everything else too.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Is that something you need to put in the comprehensive plan? So as new business come in, hey, you better have a cornice or a corner thing or some type of.
So that specific requirement wouldn't go into the comprehensive plan. That specific requirement would go into the zoning ordinance within the appropriate district. That element, though, is in the comprehensive plan right now, asking, or as an objective and as an action strategy to say, you know, for the town center, for example, or for future development, to have design standards which, you know, meet the spirit and the desired aesthetic that Hinckley Township wants to have. So the comprehensive plan says, yes, we should do that, but that's one element that then the zoning code doesn't have. What are those specifics? So that way an individual who's renovating or a new developer that's coming in knows, okay, that's when you say that, I know what you mean ahead of time. So that way I'm not, you know, surprised. Yeah.
If I might, Dave Manley, it's important people understand the township, a village, and a city are entirely different.
Yes.
Township operates under the state of Ohio regulations. Villages with their mayors and law director and so on and so forth operate under a different set of rules as cities operate. So we can't emulate what Hudson does in general speaking, obviously. Same thing with Boston Heights. There's things that they can do, they're permitted to do, we can't do. You may like them, but you can't do it here. And so it's important you understand there's three forms of government that we kicked around today. We are a township. We are a township. And the rules are Ohio revised codes. Period. That's, you find all the rules there. What we have is regulations. And the revised code is the ordinance. Or whatever name you want to use. I'm sorry.
No, it's a good point to bring up. I appreciate it.
That one in the back.
I just have a couple of points.
Could you tell me your name, please?
Sorry.
Okay.
Heidi Rouser Gutwein.
First one is I was a part of the 2015, the two meetings they had. In regard to senior housing, I remember most of the people were older, and in 7 years, the population has really changed. These little old people taking those little round dots and putting them on the maps, they have different stations around the room. They were putting those dots on there because they didn't want to leave Hinckley. This whole concept now of senior housing, how many of the people who will be residing down there are these little old people from Hinckley? I mean, they were concerned about their future here in Hinckley. I don't think that that development down there is really for the people of Hinckley. Okay, but just that being said, my second point is, it sounds to me like we're not discussing, should we approve or disapprove of conservation developments? It almost sounds from conversation going on here that we're already deciding how should we do these conservation developments. And this whole revisal of the plan came about by a small group of us who came consistently to meetings voicing our concern about what was happening to our beloved rural farmland community. The people who love our farmers driving down the middle of the road, blocking traffic. The people who like the coyotes keeping us up at night, who mow our lawns, get dirt under our fingernails. That population seems to be dwindling. The more you bring in these conservation developments under little lots, these are the people who don't have the same values and dreams that the people that I've known here for 25 years do. And we're just trying to preserve what we all moved here for. And my last thing is about conservation developments is, we're preserving green space. No, we're preserving the green money in the developers' pockets. It's a lot cheaper to build on quarter-acre lots to bring all the utilities in than it is to build, driveways and everything. So the sugar coating of, green space. And I noticed on your plan, there were a lot of trees in the green space in the conservation and very few trees in the 2-acre. We've got over 100 trees on our 5-acre plot. So it's a little concerned.
That was just a general depiction. It wasn't not necessarily a depiction for Hinckley Township.
But it's a little concerning because I feel like I thought we were here to determine what the residents want, and this little group up here is already discussing $10 million communities and, how are we going to develop it when we haven't even determined that we want to develop it? Isn't that the point of the survey?
It would be a question of the survey, to ask, what wants to be developed, if anything at all.
And please have on there about bringing water to the city. The city down here, it's the beginning of the end. You bring water in and we're screwed.
Terry Walrat. As long as did you have a chance to forward my questions to the committee?
I believe I did. It was a month ago.
You folks get questions from me?
No.
Okay. I had just 4 quick questions to deal with open space, which I think as members of the public, I think we're entitled to know what your views are with regard to open space. Number 1, how do you define open space? Number 2, do you value open space? Number 3, do you want to preserve open space? And number 4, if the answer to number 3 is yes, how do you propose to preserve open space? Thank you.
I did send it.
Yeah.
I'll take a stab at answering. So Kenton Grimes.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Kenton Grimes. So yeah, I came to Hinckley because of, the rural, my definition of rural, the open space, the small town atmosphere. I'm only on 2.5 acres, just a little over, but I've got chickens running around. I've got half a dozen kids literally running around. So anytime you drive by, there's just, a whole lot of activity at my little corner. As far as open space goes, I can't speak for what somebody else should do with their land, but, I've got areas where I've just got wildflowers growing, try to keep some bees, and, that's my idea of keeping open spaces. I'm trying not to overdo my yard with a bunch of stuff and try to leave it, playground worthy for the kids and the chickens. So that's kind of my very humble view of it. But, what someone else does with their yard, I'm not really too busy on looking at my neighbors, unfortunately. Unless they're sick, then I'll take care of their driveway.
Paul O'Neill. I'm the owner of Weymouth Farms and Orchard.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I'm the owner of Weymouth Farms and Orchard. In the middle of my orchard, I have some open space. It's about 250 foot long and about 125 foot wide. I'm about to fill that with more grapevines. So I don't know. Open space to me, I fill it up with over 6,000 apple trees, 6,000 pear trees, and about 12,000 grapevines. Is that all open space? No, it's all farmland in production. But I think a lot of you consider it open space. So, like Arthur's saying, it's all what your perspective is. Do the people in Hinckley like what I'm doing? A lot do. There's some that don't, because I'll be out with my tractor at 2 in the morning spraying pesticides, and some people don't like that, but that's the only way I'm going to be able to have a crop. Same thing with Brian Cadman. I mean, I see your equipment going down the road all the time, and people don't like it, but that's part of farming. People appreciate the farmers. Well, I have 125 acres. It very easily could be sold to Pulte or somebody, and you could have more cars on the road and more headlights. I mean, I know a lot of people talk about Hudson. Have any of you tried to drive through Hudson? It's very quaint, and they preserve some of the old structures. I think having some better architectural standards in Hinckley might be worthwhile exploring. The house I live in, it was built prior to 1820. It's the oldest house in Hinckley. And I put my heart and soul into rehabbing that house. And I built barns to match the house, all timber frame, slate roofs. And I don't know if any of you have seen some of the structures that I put up, and I hope you appreciate them. They're built with a lot of high quality stuff. I'm not a big fan of what's in the subdivisions. You have the multi-cornered roof with the slab and stick stone front. I mean, some people like that.
Some people do. Paul Easterling. Paul Easterling.
And but then there's some people that would have preferred if the garage doors didn't face the street. Maybe they face the back. I mean, people have to decide, what do you want for a look? And I'm not originally from Hinckley. I'm originally from Massachusetts, from Hingham, which is, that town was formed by the Pilgrims, and I lived on a street where you actually had to get permission from the town about what color you wanted to paint your house. There's, churches that were built in 1630 in that street. So, I mean, that's not what Hinckley is. Hinckley is, I don't know, it's, how would you characterize the classic architecture, the whole character of Hinckley? What?
Farmhouse. Yeah, it's a craftsman style, farmhouse, colonial style.
So, maybe you want to spell out that you have to follow craftsman style architecture. And maybe not. Maybe you don't want to do that. But what does that have to do with the comprehensive plan? I mean, that's more of a zoning thing. Yes, Brian. Brian Cadden.
Brian Cadman. In an effort to return to more of a common sense thing here, not that I'm insulting you, I'm usually asleep by 9 o'clock. What's your timeline on the survey, and do we have an opportunity to suggest questions?
Absolutely. So the timeline is, it's ideally, looking at proposing questions over the next week, between, getting feedback from the community, steering committee members looking at it, and coming to a conclusion. It may be something that we can talk about that we have. Our next scheduled meeting is for March, end of March, March 29th. If the steering committee is in favor, we could have that meeting set up where we're talking about those survey questions and coming to a consensus, and then having it launch after that point. So that way we can, do some homework prior to that, and then leave that meeting with a conclusion of those questions. That would entail us pushing our timeline, an additional month effectively, because then we would have that out, need that time to review the responses, and then come together to discuss those responses, and then how we would want to move forward in terms of recommendations. So that's something that we're willing to do on our side of the table. We just want to be mindful of the timing of all of this, of when this wanted to be completed, and want to be kind of concise, but in a timely manner, right? So I look to the steering committee. We'd be open to that and having that discussion as part of our next meeting, to say we're going to come there with a set of draft questions, discuss them, see what other questions we may or may not be missing, see if there's questions that, again, don't necessarily fall under the scope of what we're looking at for the comprehensive plan, but there's still good questions that we ultimately want to ask of the community.
I have a question more to the. Let me say your name again. I'm sorry, Maria Griffiths. With the conservation development, and you may not know the answer to this. You may. I thought some of that was put in because of Wakefield Run and going to court and losing in court because he didn't have something that matched with the zoning. So, personally, I'm not a fan of it, but I'm not here for my personal. I'm here to reflect what comes from the survey. If I had my druthers, we wouldn't. But can we get rid of it, or is that something we need? Because if we don't, we're going to be subject to all kinds of lawsuits and end up with stuff that I thought part of it was so that we had some control.
It is so we have some control, because what happened was the judge came in and made Wakefield Run what it is today. They made the decision. So maybe we tighten the control.
Right, that's what I'm afraid of. If we all say, hey, let's get rid of it, then we're going to lose bigger than if we have it and try to tighten the control on it.
And we did put a yield plan in place. We have not had a conservation development since.
Lou, you had a question?
Lou Benson. Just when you do the survey, are you going to, in any way, shape, or form, reflect the answers coming from the R1 versus the R2 district? In 1982, we did, when we did the master policy plan. We stuck a couple of questions in that kind of identified who was answering the survey.
Correct. And so I'm glad you brought that up, Lou, because, when we talk about that 10 to 15 range, going back, I think, to Jim and Brian, when we were talking about survey questions and what the right size is, we do not count kind of those, are you a resident of Hinckley Township, to make sure that we're getting residents. Some of those kind of definers in a way, because we can't ask those questions about, are you a resident? Are you an owner? Do you own your property? I think there was something about, renters as well. So we know who owns and who's renting property in Hinckley. So there's other questions like that we can ask, so that way we have a better understanding of the perspective of where those responses are coming from, whether that's from someone who's living in an R1 district versus an R2, or a business owner versus a homeowner So there's questions that we would build into that survey to understand where the responses are coming from.
Well, see, we did it with the school districts because you could ask a question and it would reflect either Brunswick or Highland, and then you would know where the people lived and what their attitudes were. Because I doubt I live up in the Northwest, and the people in the development Brookside Estates, I'm sure, do not covet everything that Hinckley really brought them to Hinckley at this point.
No, understood. And in some of the other surveys too, we've had, and I would have to look back and think a little bit more. We've had other questions where we've helped kind of determine where, beyond just kind of maybe even the zoning district, but where in Hinckley Township the individual who's responding to the question lives or is coming from. So we understand that perspective. We've done that by, essentially breaking down the area into kind of quadrants and asking them, are you in this quadrant, that quadrant, so on and so forth, right? Not saying that that's what we would do in this case, but I'm saying that's just an example of what we could do to help better understand where those responses are coming from. So let me ask this to kind of bring some conclusion. Oh, one more question. Go ahead.
Monique Asherle. I just have a really quick question about the slides that you put up, because I'm confused upon not understanding what the slides meant versus how they translated into the 2015 comprehensive plan. You had the treasure cards that were listed, right? And like the top 5 things, like to me, that was all saying rural Hinckley. And the number 1 thing was rural low density. I don't recall seeing anything in the 2015 comprehensive plan about low density housing. In fact, something that the previous trustee was always pointing out was the number 1 thing of the comprehensive plan was preserving the natural resources. That's very different. So are the treasure cards different than the actual wishes or what came out of the comprehensive plan? I'm just confused how they translate.
They translated into, so that I was plucking a one of several questions that were asked during the public engagement portion of that 2015 plan. And the reason why I was plucking that specific question out was going back to discussions from the last meeting as relates to the rural character and just highlighting that there's some similarities with what was thought about with respect to rural, right, and that character in Hinckley at that time and still remains true to this day. So all of those public engagement responses and feedback all effectively were assembled together and baked into those plan components and those objectives and action strategies. So without re-examining it here, I would see that those elements got assigned with maintaining the 2-acre minimum for the land use in terms of the objective. That right now in the books, it's minimum 2 acres. So that's what it is. So we want to maintain that. So to your point of maintaining that rural character and that style of residential development, that's where I would see the correlation between what was heard in that public engagement versus what was an objective and an action statement as part of that plan.
Say something real quick. My name is John Chalis, K-A-L-A-S. So I'm curious, this is, I guess, for the trustees. Is there an official Hinckley Township sustainability plan in the works?
We do not have one.
We don't have one?
No.
Are there any measures to incorporate one into the comprehensive plan?
That was something we talked about, and it would probably be a question to ask on the survey. It's a very good question. It was something the trustees had talked about last year when we were brainstorming about what topics might be of use for the audit. And 350 Community, Richard Pearl, who's part of this committee, had approached the trustees with a sustainability plan, and I think it is a valid thing to bring up.
Okay. So my thing is I kind of read some of this stuff, and I'm taking a look at some of it. It isn't anything on his website. But I guess just trying to nail down sustainability is such a vague word, right? It's not quantitative, it's qualitative, right? You can't measure it. Very difficult to do. So I guess my concern would be if we're going to put it in something like the survey, to really try to define exactly what it is that we're talking about. it's just so vague.
It is very vague.
And you can paint it with a brush and then people can come back later and, ultimately the people that set the parameters are going to be the ones that tell you whether or not, everything's up to snuff. And that can keep changing as long as we have an open-ended definition.
And it will keep changing. But if you have any suggestions, I would be happy to give you my card and you email me.
Tom Schrader, just wanted to comment. It's actually not open to subjection or opinion. There are international standards on what sustainability is and the specific measurements for carbon usage, for CO2 gas, all these things that are widely accepted throughout the world. They're just not commonly used in Ohio, right? But if you spend a few minutes and go into the international standards, ISO standards, they're very widely known outside the U.S. They're just barely making their way to the U.S. now. So typically businesses that operate in a global environment, meaning having operations globally, the investor community is really pushing those companies to meet those international standards. So, a small business here in Hinckley probably wouldn't have much exposure to that, but a larger business definitely would. So my point is that the standards are available. They're easily defined and easily measurable. So it's a little.
As far as manufacturing and stuff is kind of what you're talking about. I mean, some of the stuff that was mentioned that was mentioned on the website and the plan or whatever, it encompasses everything from the way that we build the schools and so I think it would have to be something that was definitely weighed out as a community.
That's a good point, Don.
I think it's probably one of the most important things because this is literally going to be how things go forward.
And I had actually forgotten about that we had that conversation, and I think I had maybe even brought it up before we were talking about those plans. So thank you for reminding me.
Because in the last comprehensive plan, that there was one line that was in there, okay? And that line, I have a, give me 1 second. So it says it's under enhance the green services of the township. It's action CS.32. Integrate environmentally sustainable practices as part of the township services. So from that one line, integrate environmentally sustainable practices as part of township services, there was an entire sustainability plan that came from that one line. So that wasn't part of the last comprehensive plan. It was, and obviously you guys didn't adopt it, right?
Right.
But from one line, from one word in one line, in the last comprehensive plan, we have a whole initiative that's going to dictate how things get built, how people travel. It's going to dictate everything. If, we let it again. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered, whether you're for it or against it. It's something that needs to be talked about. It's something that needs to be defined, and everyone needs to understand the impact.
Before going further, I want to thank, and my eyes are bad, 16 people online and everybody that showed up. It's a multiple of what we had last time. And I think this is a good sign that people are getting involved, letting their opinions known. I wish that it continues.
All right, the actual presentation that you're going to email out to us, I'm going to get on the website. So everyone in Hinckley Township has access to it. Does anyone have anything else before we close this evening? All right, then I'm going to make a motion to adjourn at 9:16 p.m. Can I get a second? Who seconded? I'm sorry.
Tom Schrader.
I'm going to have a trustee second.
Oh, sorry.
For the special trustee meeting. Second by Sweattick. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Sorry that you guys had my back. I apologize. Good to see you too. I apologize. I realized I'm like, oh man, I'm like you guys are behind me.